Hey there, my name is Megan and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader book tag. I originally saw this tag over at Sam's channel with thoughts on tomes. I'm not sure who did the original tag, but I'm just going to go ahead and link Sam's channel down below if you want to check out her video. So this is a tag that has 10 questions, and if you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know that I read mostly fantasy, so it's a way for you to get to know a little bit about the things that I like in fantasy. Question 1 is, what is your fantasy origin story, or how you came to read your first fantasy novel? So I remember reading the Goosebumps series in elementary school. I was obsessed with that series. I owned almost all of the books. I had all of the titles memorized and could tell you what number in the series each book was. And then I do remember when I started reading Harry Potter, I was in the 7th grade. One of my best friends had just finished reading The Sorcerer's Stone and she kept raving about it and she let me borrow it. And then she let me borrow The Chamber of Secrets and I was obsessed from them. So Goosebumps and Harry Potter were definitely the two book series that really got me into reading fantasy. Question 2 is, if you could be the heroine in your own fantasy story, who would be the author and what is one trope that you insist would be in your story? The author that I would choose would be either Anthony Ryan or Patrick Rothfuss or even Brent Weeks, because they are very good at telling stories from the character's point of view, kind of looking back on how things were. So I would want to be like an older person recounting my story to the reader. That's kind of how I would want my story to go. And I think that Patrick Rothfuss and Anthony Ryan do that narration very well. As for the trope, I don't mind traditional fantasy tropes. You could throw a chosen one trope in there. I really love those tropes. I also love the trope of the secret heir, where if there's like a farm boy or a farm girl who finds out they have like some nobility blood or they're actually a wizard and then they become famous. I love those tropes. I never get tired of them. So that is one I would definitely have to have in my own personal heroine story. Question 3 is, what is a fantasy you've read this year that you would want more people to read? That would definitely be the Risen Kingdom series by Craddock, the first one being an Alchemy, a Masques and Mirrors, and then the second one I read earlier this year, a Labyrinth of Scions and Sorcery. This series has one of the most unique worlds that I've ever encountered in a book. It reminds me very much of steampunk. It is so intelligently written and the world is so intelligently crafted. I would suggest if you were a avid high fantasy reader checking out this series for yourself. Question 4 is, what is your favorite fantasy genre and what is a subgenre that you don't read much from? My favorite fantasy subgenre is definitely steampunk, which is why I love the Risen Kingdom series so much. I just haven't found a lot of steampunk fantasy stories or steampunk in general. So if any of you have some good recommendations for good steampunk books, definitely let me know, because I feel like they're very rare, and I especially like the ones that incorporate fantasy into the steampunk environment. A subgenre that I don't read a lot from is paranormal, and the reason is that it's very hard to find a paranormal book that is not paranormal romance, and I don't want to read a paranormal romance. I like paranormal just in general. I love vampires, I love ghosts, I love all of that, but everything out there seems to be some sort of cheesy romance. So if you also have any good paranormal recommendations, please let me know, because I'm always looking for more of those as well. Question 5 is, who is your favorite fantasy auto-buy author? I don't necessarily have an auto-buy author, but there are fantasy authors that I read a lot of their work. On my shelves, I have most of Brandon Sanderson's adult works. I just don't have Warbreaker or Elantris. I also own all of Anthony Ryan's works. I own the Raven Shadow series and the Draconis Memoria series, and I also own all of Brent Weeks series. I own the Night Angel Trilogy and the Lightbringer series. So those are authors that I will definitely continue to read from. I also read a lot from Victoria Schwab. I have quite a few of her books as well. Question 6 is, how do you normally find recommendations for new fantasy books? You're looking at it, guys, BookTube. I have found so many new books because of BookTube, authors that I probably would not have taken a chance on if I hadn't heard some reviews from a booktuber. This is such a great platform in order to learn about new books. And I'm also a big user on Goodreads too. I do, before I invest in a new series, go on Goodreads and read through a lot of the reviews, both the 5-star all the way to the 1-star, to see if it's a series that I would be interested in reading. Question 7 is, what is a upcoming fantasy release that you are excited for? Of course, we have Rhythm of War, which is the 4th book in the Stormlight archives, coming out this fall by Brandon Sanderson. I just started this series and I'm already hooked and cannot wait to continue on with the story. And then going on to the Risen Kingdom series by Curtis Craddock, we have the third, and I think it's the final book coming out this August, and that is The Last Uncharted Sky. And the way that the second book ended, I am so excited to get this book. I cannot wait. It is exactly a type of story and trope that I absolutely love. And then we have Empire of the Vampire by Kristoff, which I think comes out in 2021, but we are halfway through 2020 now, so 2021 is right around the corner. This is obviously a new vampire story, an adult story by Kristoff. I am very excited for this because I personally love vampire stories, and I would love an adult vampire story that's just dark and gritty, and based on what I know about Kristoff and his Nevernight series, that's exactly what this will be. So this is already one that I will probably pick up from my library as soon as it comes out. Question 8 is, what is a misconception about fantasy that you'd like to put to rest? One misconception that I feel people have is that fantasy, especially adult high fantasy, is really hard to get into and really hard to understand. And I disagree with that. If you have an author that is a good writer and a good storyteller and knows how to lay out information and develop a world in a way that is very accessible to the reader, then getting into fantasy is not difficult. And Brandon Sanderson is excellent at that. So I don't think that fantasy is confusing if you have an author that knows what he or she is doing and is good at world building and character development and not too info dumpy. I don't think that fantasy is difficult at all to get into and or understand. Question 9 is, if someone had never read a fantasy before and you had to recommend 3 fantasy books as places to start, what recommendations would those be? The first book I would have to go with would be A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I feel like this series is very light fantasy when you put it in comparison to large epic fantasies like Wheel of Time or the Stormlight Archives. It's very easy to read. The magic is understandable. The political intrigue is understandable, and the characters are a lot of fun. It's not a book that you have to learn a bunch of history and learn a bunch of backstory in order to understand what's going on. The next series I would recommend would be the Mage Trilogy or Promise of Blood, which is the first book in the series by Mcclellan. This is a more military heavy fantasy series. The reason that I would recommend it is because I find that the magic system is very understandable in this book. It's not complicated at all. You have powder mages that can ingest gunpowder and get like enhanced abilities because of that. And then you also have sorcerers, but this book is mostly focused on the military strategies. It's not so much focused on the magic or the world. So I feel like it would be a good place to start because you aren't going to be bogged down with a bunch of magic and a bunch of different rules that you have to learn, but you'll still get that good world building and that whole politicalness of a classic fantasy. And the last series that I would recommend would be the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This is getting into more complex magic systems, but Brandon Sanderson is just so good at explaining these magic systems so as not to confuse the reader. And it's a good introduction because I think that Brandon Sanderson's writing is just very easy to understand. It flows very well. He knows how to lay out bits of information within the story so that the reader doesn't feel bombarded with information and having to remember how all the things within his world function. And I think that's one of his talents as a fantasy writer. Plus, this is just such a good story. It's so interesting. It's so much fun. And it's definitely not like a traditional fantasy if you think about it. So I think that any of Sanderson's works would be a good place to start. Question 10 is, who is the most recent fantasy content creator that you've come across that you would like to give a shout out to? I'm going to shout out Ramsey over at Rajathon, and I will go ahead and link his channel down below. He and I seem to have very similar reading tastes, and I always kind of look over on his channel once I start a new book to see if he has read it and reviewed it, but he does a lot of recommendations. He does a lot of book tags, and his book reviews are just so in-depth, and it really helps me to ascertain if it's a book that I am interested in reading based on his opinion. So definitely check out his channel if you have not done so already. Okay, you guys, so that is it for my Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I hope you learned a little bit more about me and my love for fantasy. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and do so by clicking that subscribe button as well as the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I post new content. I post new videos every Sunday, and sometimes I post bonus videos in the middle of the week. And I will see you soon with another one. Goodbye.